The first thing Cassia Ferreira did in any room she entered was count the ways out of it. She did it without thinking, the way other people check the time. Doorway behind her. Service hatch under the third bench, hinged, probably stiff. Ventilation grill high on the left wall, too small for a Kesherin but large enough for a 15-year-old human girl who was not too proud to ruin her uniform. Emergency locker forward, sealed with a pull tab that had faded from red to a sunburnt pink because nobody in 61 years had ever pulled it. 4 ways out. She logged them, filed them, and sat down. Nobody else in comparative environments 300 had ever counted anything. That was the part that still unsettled her, 8 months into her placement at the academy at Threshold. Not the 4-jointed arms of the Kesherins, not the way the Alu students glowed faintly along their throats when they were embarrassed, not the smell of the corridors, which was clean in a way that clean things on Earth never quite managed. It was that 240 students walked into that lecture hall every cycle, and none of them looked up. None of them looked back. None of them had the faintest idea where the exits were, and none of them cared, because caring would have been an insult. Threshold Station had the Aegis. The Aegis watched. "Attend, please," said Instructor Having Oro, unfolding himself from his desk with the slow dignity of a species that had never once had to hurry. He was Alu, tall and narrow, his skin the soft matte gray of a moth's wing, and he was, by a distance, the kindest teacher Cass had ever had. That kindness was going to be a problem later, though neither of them knew it yet. Today we conclude our unit on environmental selection pressure, and as promised, we conclude it with a demonstration. 240 heads turned toward Cass in the same instant, like a field of flowers finding the sun. She kept her face still. She had gotten good at that. "Cadet Ferreira," said Having with an apologetic dip of his crest, "if you would." Cass stood. She walked down the aisle steps to the demonstration floor, and she did not hurry, because hurrying looked like nerves, and nerves were blood in the water. She stopped at the mark and turned to face the tiered rows of them, and she thought, not for the first time, that if you had told her at 11 years old that she would end up standing in a lecture hall on a station orbiting a gas giant, being displayed like a specimen to an audience of 8 species, she would have believed you instantly. She just would not have believed the part where it was boring. "Gravity," said Having, and the display behind him bloomed with a slow-turning image of Earth, blue and white and terrible. 1.0 standard by definition, since the compact took the human homeworld as the reference point, not because it is average, because it is memorable. A ripple of amusement. Atmospheric composition, 21% free oxygen. He let that sit. He always let that sit. A gas so violently reactive that its presence in a planetary atmosphere was, for 400 years, considered by our own survey doctrine to be a marker of a world too unstable to host complex life. Humans breathe it. Humans require it. Humans set fire to things for entertainment. More laughter. Cass let it go past her. Weather, Having continued. Uncontrolled. Cyclonic storms which release in a single event energy comparable to the total output of this station across 9 standard years. Tectonic instability, predation. Endemic microbial competition, so aggressive that human immune response is regarded by compact medicine as a form of low-grade autoimmune warfare conducted continuously, from birth until death. He turned to her and his voice softened, and this was the part Cass hated because he meant it kindly. "Cadet Ferreira, would you describe your homeworld as dangerous?" She thought about the answer she was supposed to give. The one that made them laugh, that made her likable, that made the whole thing easier. Then she thought about her grandmother, who had stood on a seawall in a storm coat with her hand wrapped around Cass's wrist, and had not said anything poetic at all, only, "Count your exits, Mija. The sea does not care that you are 11. "No, sir," Cass said. "I'd describe it as honest." Having blinked, honest. It never pretends to be watching out for you. She kept her hands loose at her sides. "So you learn to watch out for yourself. That's not danger. Danger is when something's coming and you've forgotten how to look." The hall was very quiet. And then, from the fourth tier, a voice like a stone dropped into a well. "That is an ugly thing to say in a room protected by the Aegis." Cass did not have to look. She knew the voice. Everyone knew the voice. Torin Val was Kesharin, and Kesharins were the strongest species in the compact, and Torin Val had never once let anybody forget either fact. He stood 2 meters and change, and every centimeter of him was engineered by 2 million years of a heavy, sullen homeworld. Double-elbowed arms, plated forearms, a chest like a cargo strut. He was 17. His family had built 4 of the compact's inner-ring stations and financed the 5th. And his uncle, this was the part that mattered, though Cass did not know yet how much it mattered. His uncle was Custodian Prime Oswar Ven, the man responsible for the Aegis itself. "Cadet Val," said Having mildly, "the floor is not yours." With respect, instructor, she insulted the vigil. Torin did not sit. He never sat when standing would do. 61 years, 0 incidents, 0. Not a single act of violence on this station in 6 decades, because the Aegis sees everything and forgets nothing. And she stands there and says, "We've forgotten how to look." He spread all 4 hands, appealing to the room. "Look at what? We don't need to look. That's the entire point of civilization. We built something that never blinks so that we would never have to." And the room, Cass watched it happen, the way she had watched it happen 100 times in 8 months. The room agreed with him. Not because he was likable. He wasn't. Because he was saying the thing they all believed so deeply they had never once had to say it out loud. That was the moment Cass understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water down her spine, that she was not surrounded by people who were safe. She was surrounded by people who had never been unsafe, and had therefore never learned the difference. The Aegis was, by any honest measure, the finest security architecture ever built by anyone. Cass had read the specifications, because reading the specifications was the sort of thing she did instead of sleeping. 211,000 sensor nodes woven through every corridor, chamber, duct, and lift shaft of Threshold Station. Optical, thermal, acoustic, chemical, gravimetric. Pattern recognition trained on 11 species worth of body language, refined for 61 years, capable of flagging an assault 3 full seconds before the first blow landed. Response cells stationed at 90-second reach from any point on the station. A custodial intelligence layer, called simply custody, that did not sleep, did not blink, and did not, as far as any resident of Threshold was concerned, fail. Every node had a pilot light, a little amber bead set into the housing, so small that most people had genuinely never noticed it. Steady amber meant the eye was open. Cass noticed. Cass had noticed on her 3rd day, and she had asked instructor Having what the little lights were, and he had smiled at her with fond confusion, the way you'd smile at a child asking why the floor stayed down. "They tell you the node is functioning," he'd said. "And when it isn't, it goes dark, but Cadet Ferreira, they do not go dark. That is rather the point of them." She had gone back to her cabin that night and started a list. Not on her slate. The slate belonged to the station, and the station belonged to the Aegis, and there was a small hard voice in the back of Cass Ferreira's skull, a voice with her grandmother's accent, that said, "Do not keep your only copy of anything inside the thing you are watching." So she had done something that would have made every student on Threshold laugh themselves sick, if they'd known. She had bought a paper notebook from a novelty stall on the commercial ring, and a stylus that made marks with actual pigment, and she had started writing down every dark eye she saw. Corridor level, time, duration. 8 months, 406 entries. She had never told anyone, because she did not have a theory yet. She only had the itch, the small persistent wrongness, like a splinter under the nail, of a system that everyone swore had never failed. going quietly dark in corridor after corridor, always in the low-traffic wings, always in intervals of 11 to 19 minutes, always at the times when nobody who mattered was watching. She just kept writing it down. That was the difference between Cassia Ferreira and every other student at the academy at Threshold, and it was not strength, and it was not courage, and it certainly was not the 21% oxygen. It was this. When the world told her don't worry, something is watching, some deep evolutionary part of her, forged in storms and predators, and 100,000 years of being neither the fastest nor the strongest thing on the savannah, answered back. Watching isn't the same as caring, and caring isn't the same as arriving. Pell found her in the arboretum after class, which meant Pell had been waiting, which meant Pell was afraid of something. Pell was Turin, hollow-boned, crest-feathered, about the size of a large dog if the dog stood upright and wore a school uniform and apologized constantly. Pell's shoulders were narrow enough that Cass could have circled them with her hands. Pell had been at Threshold for 2 years before Cass arrived, and for those 2 years Pell had been what the older students called, with a laugh, portable. They picked Pell up. That was the whole joke. They picked Pell up and put Pell somewhere Pell could not get down from and left, and the Aegis saw all of it and nothing happened, because the Aegis was a security system and not a moral one, and lifting a smaller student was not, technically, violence. You should not have said that thing, Pell said. The crest was flat. In class, about looking. Cass sat down on the bench beside the water feature, and Pell perched, bird-like feet gripping the edge. It's true. Truth is not a shield. Pell's voice had a musical rasp to it, 3 tones layered. Torin has been saying things, to Desi, to the Odo twins. Torin's always saying things. Not like this. Pell's head tilted all the way over, the full 90 degrees that always made Cass's neck ache in sympathy. He said you called him a coward, in front of the hall. He said you called all of us cowards, and that the instructors laughed, and that no one would do anything about it because the instructors love their pet human. A pause. He said that someone should show you what the strongest species in the compact actually is. He said that before. Yes, Pell's foot claws tightened on the bench edge. But this time he laughed, Cassia, he laughed, and he said it did not matter what the Aegis saw. And there it was. Cass felt it land in her stomach, cold and clean and almost. She was ashamed of this later, and she never told anyone, almost welcome, because 8 months of that itch under the nail was 8 months too long. It did not matter what the Aegis saw. Not the Aegis will see and nobody will care. Not my uncle will get me out of it. Those were the sentences a rich boy said. Those were the sentences a bully with a name and a family said, and she'd been waiting for those sentences since her 2nd week. It did not matter what the Aegis saw was a different sentence entirely. That was the sentence of someone who knew the Aegis wasn't going to see. Cass sat very still on the bench in the arboretum, with the water making its expensive, tasteful noise, and she thought about 406 entries in a paper notebook, and intervals of 11 to 19 minutes, and the low-traffic wings, and she felt the whole shape of the thing begin to rise out of the dark like a reef under a hull. Pell, she said, what's your last class tomorrow? Pell's crest lifted, uncertain. Structural ethics, ring 4, why? Ring 4. Ring 4, where the old hydroponics annex had been decommissioned last year, and was now scheduled for a 9-month retrofit, and where Cass could see the page in her notebook without closing her eyes, the pigment slightly smudged where her hand had dragged, where 71 of her 406 dark eyes had been. Nothing, she said. Walk with me tomorrow. Don't take the Ring 4 transverse alone. Why? Cass looked at the small, frightened, hollow-boned creature beside her, who had been picked up and put on shelves for 2 years by a station full of people who genuinely believed nothing bad ever happened here, and she made a decision that she would spend the rest of her life being glad about. "Because I'm going to be there," she said, "and I'd like the company." Custodian Prime Oswar then made his weekly address at 1900 from the atrium, as he had for 11 years. He was Cethran, which meant he was tall and gray and moved like a man conducting an orchestra of himself, and he was, Cass had to admit, magnificent at this. He did not need notes. He stood beneath the plaque, the famous one, the one that got put on every recruitment broadcast the compact ever made, and he let the number speak for itself. Threshold Station. The Unbroken Vigil. * 61 years, 0 incidents. 61 years, said Venn, and his voice filled the atrium the way water fills a cup. Do you understand what that number means? It does not mean we have been fortunate. Fortune is what barbarians call the absence of engineering. Gentle laughter from the assembled. It means that on this station, a child may walk any corridor at any hour and be seen *, be known *, be held. It means we have abolished the oldest terror in the galaxy, the terror of being alone with someone who wishes you harm. Cass stood at the back with her hands behind her and watched him and thought, he believes it. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward in the inquiry when they asked her what she had thought of him. He believed it, every word. He had built his entire self around that number, and the number had become a thing he was defending rather than a thing he was measuring. And somewhere in the last decade, the difference between those two had quietly killed his ability to see a fault report as anything other than an insult. There will be, Venn continued, as some of you have noticed, brief sanctioned intervals of reduced coverage in the decommissioned sections during the Ring 4 retrofit. This is routine. This is scheduled. The Aegis is not * down in these intervals. The Aegis is * reallocated * as a healthy body draws blood from the extremities to protect the core. He smiled. You are, of course, encouraged to avoid the retrofit zones, not because they are unsafe. Because they are * dusty. The atrium laughed with him. Cass did not laugh. Cass had gone very cold and very quiet, and her heart was doing a slow, heavy thing against her ribs, because she had just heard a man stand in front of 1,100 children and explain, in a warm and reassuring voice, that the eyes went dark on a * schedule. A schedule. Which meant a schedule existed *. Which meant a schedule could be known *. Which meant that somewhere in this station, right now, there was a boy with double-elbowed arms and plated forearms and an uncle who loved him. And that boy was looking at a list of times and places where nothing would be recorded, and he was choosing one. Cassia Ferreira walked back to her cabin through corridors full of amber lights. She took out the notebook. She turned to a clean page, and under the date, in small, careful letters, she wrote, Ring 4, Transverse 9, tomorrow 17/20/1740. Not a guess, a prediction. Bring shoes you can run in. Then she closed the book, put it in her jacket and went to bed and slept badly, the way her grandmother had taught her to sleep the night before a storm, fully clothed with the door unlocked so that if it came, she would not waste a single second on the lock. The morning came the way mornings came on Threshold, without weather. That was the thing Cass had never gotten used to. Not the artificial gravity, not the recycled air, not the great banded face of the gas giant Oceline rolling past the observation galleries like a slow storm that would never actually reach you. It was the absence of * warning *. On Earth, you woke up and the sky told you something, pressure in your sinuses, a particular yellow-green light before hail, the gulls going quiet. On Threshold, the day arrived on schedule at the correct temperature and told you nothing at all. She dressed, she ate, she went to her classes and she sat through them and she took notes, and if any of the instructors noticed that the human girl in the third row was quieter than usual, none of them remarked on it, because Human affect was widely considered unreadable, and it was polite not to try. At the mid-cycle break, she went to Ring 4. She did not go into the annex. She went past it, at a walking pace, on the transverse, with a slate in her hand and the studious middle-distance stare of a student thinking about something else entirely, and she looked at the ceiling. 11 nodes along Transverse 9. 11 amber lights, steady as anything. For a moment, a long, ugly moment, she felt the whole edifice of her certainty tilt. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was the paranoid human, the Deathworld freak who saw predators in a corridor because her ancestors had needed to see predators in the grass, and 8 months of notebook entries were nothing but the ordinary maintenance breathing of a machine too complex for her to understand. Maybe Torin was just a loudmouth. Maybe Pell had misheard. Then she looked at the third node from the junction and saw that it had been turned. Not damaged, not covered. Turned, rotated in its housing, perhaps 15 degrees, so that its cone of coverage swung away from the annex hatch and toward the blank wall opposite. It would still report as functional. It would still show amber. It would still, faithfully and honestly, record absolutely nothing that happened in front of that hatch. Cass kept walking. She did not stop, did not slow, did not look back. She went to a maintenance alcove 2 junctions down, sat on an equipment crate, took out the notebook, and wrote with a hand that was not entirely steady. Node R4T903 rotated approx 15 degrees off-axis toward bulkhead. Deliberate. Someone climbed for that. Then she sat there for 4 full minutes with her elbows on her knees, breathing. The thing nobody understood about fear, the thing she could never explain to the Alu or the Cithran or the Vesic, who lived their whole lives inside a machine that promised them nothing bad would ever happen, was that fear was not the problem. Fear was asterisk information. Fear was the oldest and most reliable instrument any human being had ever carried, and it had exactly one flaw, which was that it screamed the same volume whether the thing coming for you was a hurricane or a boy. You could not turn it off. You could only make it work for you. So Cassia Ferreira sat in a maintenance alcove on the Ring 4 transverse of a station where nothing bad had happened in 61 years, and she let the fear talk, and she wrote down what it said. 5 of them probably: Torin, Desi, the Odo twins, and Marrow. Torin wants an audience. He won't do it alone. That's the weakness. They'll block the transverse and push me into the annex. Nowhere else to push. The annex has one hatch. That's what makes it attractive to him. So the annex is where the mistake is, if there's a mistake. She went and looked. The old hydroponics annex, Ring 4, had been the pride of Threshold Station for 40 years, and had spent the last 14 months being slowly gutted. The hatch stood open, retrofit protocol, propped on a mag clamp, and beyond it the chamber opened up into a long, high, echoing volume with the racks torn out and the grow lights hanging dead from their gantries like the ribs of something enormous. Dust in the air, actual dust, hanging in the cold light, scaffold along the far wall, sealant drums stacked in 3s. Cass walked the whole thing in 9 minutes, slowly touching things. She found the scaffold and tested whether it was locked to the deck. It was not. She found a coil of static line and left it where it was, and remembered where it was. She found 4 sealant drums and read the labels on all of them, because reading labels was free. Vacuum cure structural sealant, type 4, do not occupy during cure cycle. Cure cycle requires full atmospheric evacuation of the application volume. Interlocked to life sign detection. See Station Safety Directive 11. She read that 3 times. Then she went and found the pump. It was at the far end of the annex, mounted in the wall, an evacuation trunk as wide as her shoulders with a scheduling plate beside it, and the scheduling plate was a lit panel with a countdown, and the countdown said, Atmospheric evacuation, cure cycle 1 of 6. Scheduled, day 214, 1720. Interlock life sign detection Aegis, active. Day 214 was today. 1720 was the beginning of the window she had written in her notebook the night before. Cassia Ferreira stood alone in a gutted chamber on the outer ring of a station full of children, and she felt the floor go strange under her, and she understood, all at once, the whole shape of it, the reef under the hull, exactly what was going to happen, and exactly why, and exactly how little any of the people involved knew about what they were actually doing. Torrenval had a schedule. He had it from his uncle, or from his uncle's office, or from a cousin in custody who thought he was doing a rich boy a small, harmless favor. He had picked a dark window in a low-traffic wing, because he wanted 20 unrecorded minutes with a human girl and no witnesses, and he had probably spent a genuinely enjoyable evening feeling clever about it. He did not know about the sealant. He did not know that the reason a dark window existed at all asterisk in this particular corridor on this particular day was that the retrofit crew had asked for the sensors to be reallocated so their equipment wouldn't trip false positives during the cure prep. He did not know that the same Aegis coverage he had arranged to have looking the other way was the only thing standing between that pump and the air in his lungs, because the interlock, the safety, the great and holy safety, did not have its own eyes. It borrowed the Aegis's. That was the whole architecture. Every safety system on Threshold Station, every fail-safe, every abort, every guardian angel in the walls, drew its senses from one place, because building a second set of eyes would have implied that the first set could fail, and implying that the first set could fail was, on Threshold Station, something between a technical error and a blasphemy. 61 years, 0 incidents, 1 nervous system. Cass put her hand flat against the cold wall beside the pump, and she said, out loud to nobody, "You built a body with no reflexes." She thought about telling someone. She thought about it for a long time, and the fact that she thought about it, the fact that she tried, was the thing that saved her later, when the board wanted to know why she had not simply reported it. She went to Instructor Having first, because he was kind. She found him in his office at 1400, and she stood in front of his desk with her notebook in her hand, and she told him that she believed she was going to be assaulted on the Ring 4 transverse at 1720, that she believed the sensor coverage would be dark, that she believed a node had been physically rotated, and that there was a scheduled atmospheric evacuation in the annex that was interlocked to a system that would not be watching. Having listened, he listened all the way through without interrupting, and he did not laugh, and Cass would be grateful to him for that for the rest of her life. Then he said gently, "Cadet Ferreira, may I see the notebook?" She gave it to him. He turned the pages with 2 long gray fingers, and she watched his face, and she watched the kindness in it slowly become something worse than disbelief. It became concern for her. "You have been keeping this for 8 months, he said. "Yes, sir." "By hand?" "Yes, sir." "Cassia," he set it down, "do you know how this looks?" "I know how it is." "That is not the same thing, and at your age and your position on this station, it needs to be." He folded his hands. "You are the first human student Threshold has ever accepted. There are 40,000 people in this system who believe that was a mistake, and they are all waiting patiently, politely, and with enormous goodwill for you to give them a reason. And you are about to walk into the provost's office with a paper document, written by yourself, unverifiable by any system, alleging that the Aegis has been failing for 8 months, and that the custodian prime's nephew has obtained the maintenance schedule in order to commit a violent crime." He paused. "Do you hear it?" She heard it. She heard it in his mouth, and it sounded exactly like what it was, a frightened girl who did not trust the walls. "Then verify it," she said. "You, right now. Pull the fault log for Ring 4, compare it to my dates, that's all I'm asking. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and you can have me evaluated, and I'll never say another word." And having Oro, kind, decent, entirely well-meaning having Oro, did the thing that everybody on Threshold Station did, the thing that was so deep in them that it did not even register as a choice. He asked the Aegis. He turned to his terminal and he queried the fault log for Ring 4, sections 1 through 9, retroactive 240 days, and the terminal thought about it for less than a second, and it returned. Faults 0. Coverage integrity 100%. Sanctioned reallocation intervals 71. All intervals nominal, no anomaly. Having turned the screen toward her, and his eyes were so sad. 71, Cass said. Her voice came out flat. Sir. There are 71 entries in my notebook for Ring 4. It's the same number. Yes, he said kindly. You have been counting the sanctioned intervals. They are published, Cassia, in the maintenance bulletin. Any student can read them. He said it as if he were handing her a gift, as if he were rescuing her from a delusion, as if the terrible thing you've been afraid of is only the ordinary breathing of the machine. There is no conspiracy. There is only a retrofit. And the rotated node. Vibration. The retrofit runs heavy plan on that transverse. And the evacuation cycle. Interlocked, he said, to life sign detection. Cassia, even if every node on that transverse were dark, the interlock would still be reading through the core asterisk array. The Aegis reallocates. It does not asterisk stop asterisk. He smiled and he meant it, and he genuinely believed he was comforting her. The station will not pump the air out of a room with a child in it. It cannot. It has never even come close. Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her notebook and she said, "Thank you for listening, sir. Really. You're the only one who would have." And she walked out, and in the corridor she stopped, and put her back against the cold wall, and closed her eyes, and let herself have exactly 5 seconds of being 15 years old and completely alone. Then she opened her eyes. "All right," said the small, hard voice with her grandmother's accent. "Nobody's coming." "So what do you have?" She had a rotated node and a countdown, and a coil of static line, and a scaffold that wasn't clamped to the deck. She had 5 of them and one of her. She had a small hollow-boned friend who would be walking that transverse at 17:15 because structural ethics let out on the hour. And she realized, with a slow, savage calm that frightened her more than the fear had, the enormous, unearned, staggering advantage of being the only person on Threshold Station who already knew that the walls were empty. At 16:40, she went to her cabin and changed her shoes. At 16:50, she went to the Ring 4 transverse and walked its length twice, and put a wedge of folded ration pack card under the annex hatch's mag clamp release, where nobody would look, because a mag clamp that could not disengage was a hatch that could not close. At 17:10, she stood at the junction of Transverse 9 and waited for structural ethics to let out. At 17:14, one by one, the amber lights went out. She watched it happen. She made herself watch it. Node 11, then Node 10, then 9, in a slow ripple down the corridor toward her, each little bead of light simply asterisk ceasing, without a sound, without an alarm, without so much as a change in the corridor's ambient hum. Because why would there be an alarm? An alarm would imply something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. This was asterisk sanctioned asterisk. This was the healthy body drawing blood from the extremities to protect the core. 11 eyes closed in 11 seconds over the heads of 140 students who were at that moment walking out of structural ethics and had not looked up, would never look up, had never in their lives had a single reason to look up. Cassia Ferreira looked up. And in the sudden, absolute, unwatched dark of a corridor that 1,100 children believed was the safest place in the galaxy, she heard, behind her, the unmistakable 4-beat footfall of a Kesherin who had stopped bothering to be quiet. "Human," said Torinval pleasantly, "walk with us." There were 5 of them, exactly as she had written in the notebook. Torin in the center. Desi on his left, Alu and elegant, throat glowing a slow, smug amber that almost matched the dead pilot lights. The Odo twins, Prow and Pry, flanking wide, Vesic, low-slung, six-limbed, built for tunnels and for coming at you from angles. And at the back, half a step behind and looking at the floor, Marrow Cade. Cass filed that, Marrow's looking at the floor. And in Prow Odo's middle right hand, held down along the thigh in the way people hold things they have not yet decided to be honest about, was a corrector wand. Livestock equipment, compact agricultural supply, standard issue, entirely legal, sold in any commercial ring hardware stall to anyone with a herd license and a pulse. It delivered a non-lethal neural discharge that produced, in any species with a spinal cord, approximately 11 seconds of absolute screaming agony and no lasting damage whatsoever. No lasting damage. That was the phrase in the catalog. That was, presumably, the phrase Torin Val had read and found reassuring. "You've got the wrong corridor," Cass said. Her voice was steady. She was distantly, clinically impressed by that. Torin laughed, a real laugh, delighted, a boy who had been looking forward to this all day. "No, this is exactly the corridor." He gestured up, all four hands, at the black beads of the sensor housings. "Do you know what those are, human? Those are the eyes of the Aegis. 61 years, 0 incidents." He took a step. "And right now, for the next 19 minutes, they are asterisk closed. Not broken, not sabotaged. Sanctioned asterisk." He tapped his skull with a plated knuckle. "There is no crime in an unrecorded room. There's just a story. And there are 5 of us and one of you, and my uncle signs the report." Behind them, at the far end of the transverse, the last of the structural ethics students were drifting away toward the lifts, chattering, unhurried, not looking. And in the middle of them, standing very still, with a crest gone bone-white and both small hands pressed flat against the wall, was Pell. Desi followed Cass's eyes and smiled and said, "Oh, we brought the pet." Odo went and got Pell. It was casual. That was the thing Cass would describe to the board later, when they asked her to characterize the assault, and she would see them not understand. It was asterisk casual asterisk. Pry simply walked into the stream of departing students, took Pell by the arm and walked back, and 140 children watched it happen with their own eyes, and not one of them stopped, because in 61 years nothing bad had ever happened on Threshold Station, and therefore nothing bad was happening now, and therefore what they were seeing was a joke they didn't get. They just kept walking. Cass watched the last of them turn the corner toward the lifts, and the transverse emptied, and the silence came down like a lid. "Into the annex," said Torin. She went. That was the part that people found hardest to believe afterward, and the part that Cass never bothered defending. You walked in, willingly, into a sealed room with 5 of them. Yes, because a corridor is a place you can be run down in, and a corridor with a hatch at one end is a shooting gallery, and because if she broke and ran toward the lifts, they would catch her in 9 strides and they would have Pell, and because, and this was the calculation that had been sitting cold and complete in the back of her skull since 1400 hours, the annex was the only room on this station where she knew something that Torin Val did not. So Cassia Ferreira walked through the hatch into the gutted dark of the old hydroponics annex with her hands loose at her sides, and behind her came 5 students who thought they were about to have an unrecorded afternoon. The hatch tried to close. She heard it. The mag clamp hummed, took up the load, and stuck because there was a folded wedge of ration pack card jammed in the release housing where nobody would ever look, and a mag clamp that cannot disengage is a hatch that cannot close. It stayed open a hand's width. Nobody noticed. Nobody looked. "Put Pell down," Cass said. "Kneel," said Torin. "Put Pell down and I'll kneel." That threw him. She watched it land, watched the small, sour hesitation go across a face built for certainty, because he had prepared for defiance, and he had prepared for tears, and he had not prepared for a asterisk negotiation. And negotiation implies two parties, and two parties implies she was not yet furniture. "You don't set terms," he said. "Not." She kept her voice flat and reasonable and a little bored, which was the single hardest piece of physical performance of her entire life. "I'm telling you the price of the thing you want. You want me on my knees in front of you. Fine, that's yours. It costs 1 Turin, set down gently on the floor. Or we can do it the other way, where you spend the next 19 minutes chasing me around a room full of scaffolding, and at the end of it you get nothing, and everybody sees you didn't get it." Silence. Everybody sees. That was the hook. Not the Aegis. She'd taken the Aegis off the table for him. He'd done that himself. He was so proud of it. The 4 people standing behind him. The audience. The whole reason he had brought them. Torin jerked his chin. Pry dropped Pell, not gently, but dropped, and Pell scrambled sideways on all fours and fetched up against the base of the scaffold, shaking. Cass went down on one knee. She put her hands on her thighs, and she looked up at Torin Val, and she said calmly, "You should know that I'm not afraid of you." "You're shaking." "That's adrenaline, it's not the same thing." She tilted her head. "You've never had it, have you? Not really. Nothing's ever tried to eat you." "Nothing's ever tried." "Something tried to eat me when I was 9, Cass said. "It was a dog, 40 kilos. It came out from under a boat in Recife and it took my forearm in its mouth and it shook." She let that sit in the cold, dusty air of the annex. "I lived. It didn't. And I want you to understand something, Torin, because I think you're going to be a very unhappy adult otherwise. I have been in a room with something that wanted to kill me, and you have been in a room with someone who didn't like your jokes, and you have somehow got it into your head that those are the same." Nobody moved. And then Desi Marn, glowing bright with embarrassment on Torin's behalf, said, "Use the wand." Prou Odo came in from the left, because Vesic always come in from angles. Cass had been kneeling for 11 seconds. She had spent every one of them mapping it. Prou's stance, the wand held low in the middle right hand, the twins' habit. She'd watched them for 8 months in the refectory of always leading with the left pair of limbs. She did not stand up. Standing up takes time and it telegraphs. She came off the knee, low and sideways, inside the swing of the wand, and she did not try to block it and she did not try to grab it, because a 15-year-old human girl does not outmuscle a Vesic, and Cass had never once in her life confused what she wanted to be true with what was. She took hold of Prou's wrist, the joint, the hinge, the small betraying place where all that strength has to pass through a hole, and she turned it the way it did not want to go, and she kept turning, and she put her hip under the elbow and let Prou's own forward weight do the work. The wand hit the deck and skittered. Prou went down onto 4 limbs, hissing, more shocked than hurt, and Cass was already moving, not toward the wand, because the wand was a trap. The wand was bait, and if she reached for it she'd be bent over and stationary with 4 of them behind her. She kicked it. Hard, flat, a soccer kick with the inside of her foot, and the corrector wand went spinning away down the length of the annex into the dark under the sealant drums, 40 meters away, unlit and unfindable. Then she stepped back and put the scaffold at her shoulder and said, "Right. Now we're all the same size." What followed was not a fight exactly. A fight implies both sides are doing the same activity. What happened in the old hydroponics annex over the next 4 minutes was that 5 students tried to catch a human being, and could not, and became progressively more frightened by their inability to do so. Cass never let them close. She used the racks, the torn-out grow-rack stanchions, waist-high, a forest of them, and she moved through that forest at a pace that made the Odo twins, who were built low and fast for tunnels, keep clipping their shoulders on steel. She kept the scaffold on her right. She kept Pell behind her always, without ever once looking at Pell, steering the whole moving shape of the thing by walking asterisk away from where Pell was, so that 5 bodies followed her away from the small one on the floor. She did not throw a punch, not one. She never even closed a fist. She learned that from her grandmother too, though her grandmother had been talking about the sea. You don't fight it. You can't. You just refuse to be where it is. Desi lunged and got a handful of jacket, and Cass turned into the grip instead of away, which is the last thing anybody expects. And Desi's own pull took Desi past her and into a stanchion, and Cass let the jacket go entirely, just shrugged out of it, left it in Desi's hands like a lizard leaving a tail, and was gone. Pry came over the top of a rack and Cass did not dodge. She ducked and lifted asterisk, one shoulder under the ribs, and dumped Pry onto the deck in a way that knocked out wind and dignity and nothing else. And Torrens stood in the middle of it, turning, 4 arms out, roaring at them to hold her, and getting angrier and more baffled, because he was 2 meters and change of the strongest species in the compact, and he could not lay a single hand on a girl who weighed 51 kilos, and it was making him look ridiculous in front of his friends. Which was, of course, the entire point. Cassia Ferreira could not beat 5 students in a fight. She had known that from the first moment on the Transverse. She did not need to. She needed to make the asterisk audience stop wanting to be there, and she was watching it work, in real time, the way it always works. Marocade had backed all the way to the wall and was not participating. Prow was sitting on the deck holding a wrist. Desi had stopped glowing. She needed 4 more minutes. That was all. 4 more minutes and the window would close and the eyes would open, and this would be over, and she would walk out of here with Pell and a bruise and a name, and she would find someone somewhere who would listen. At 17:20 precisely, the scheduling plate on the far wall chimed. A pleasant chime, a friendly one, the sort of sound a well-designed machine makes when it wants to tell you that everything is proceeding exactly as intended. And Cassia Ferreira, standing in the middle of a forest of steel stanchions with her jacket gone and her heart going like a fist on a door, heard it and went absolutely still, because she had been so busy staying alive that she had let herself forget, for 4 entire minutes, the thing she had come here knowing. Atmospheric evacuation, cure cycle 1 of 6, commencing. Interlock, life sign detection, no signal. Proceeding. The hatch began to close. The mag clamp hummed, took up the load, and stuck on a folded wedge of ration pack card jammed into the release housing by a 15-year-old girl 3 hours earlier, and the hatch shuddered and stopped, and stood open a hand's width and began to strain. And the pump started. It did not sound like anything at first. That was the part Cass would try and fail to explain later. There was no roar, no shriek of escaping atmosphere, no dramatic pull. The evacuation trunk in the far wall simply began to draw, smoothly, at the rate that a well-engineered industrial system draws, and the air in the old hydroponics annex began to leave, and the first sign of it was not sound at all. It was the dust. The hanging dust in the cold light, the dust that had been drifting so beautifully for 14 months, all of it, everywhere in the enormous room, turned at once and began to move in one direction. Cass saw it. Cass understood it in a quarter of a second, in her spine, in the animal part, the part with her grandmother's accent, the part that had been screaming at her for 8 months about lights that went dark on a schedule. The Kesharan did not see it. The Alu did not see it. The Vesic twins, who had evolved in tunnels, tunnels, whose ancestors had suffocated in collapses for 1,000,000 years before their species ever built a machine, did not see it, because their species had not needed to see it in 9,000 years, because the machines had always seen it for them. Torrens, said Cass. He turned, snarling, now you want to. The air is leaving. He stared at her, and she watched the sentence go into him and find nothing to attach to asterisk, not disbelief. Something much stranger and much worse. She watched a boy hear the words asterisk the air is leaving and reach, instantly, automatically, without any conscious thought at all, for the certainty that had been poured into him since birth. And say, with total confidence, "That's not possible," the interlock. His ears popped. She saw it happen. She saw all four of his hands come up to the sides of his head, and she saw the confusion on his face, the genuine, childlike, uncomprehending confusion, and she thought, with a clarity that she would be ashamed of and would never quite apologize for. "You have never in your life had to be afraid of a room." Desi screamed. The Odo twins bolted for the hatch for the hand's width of gap, for the light, 6 limbs each, scrabbling and hit it and could not fit and beat on it. And the mag clamp strained against a folded piece of card and held the gap open and could not open further, and the pump went on drawing calmly, competently, exactly as scheduled, because nothing had told it to stop. Nothing was going to tell it to stop. There was no one watching. And Cassia Ferreira, 15 years old, 51 kilos of Recife and the seawall and the storm coat, stood in the middle of a room that was dying and heard her grandmother say, very clearly, the way she had said it on the wall with the water coming, "Count your exits, Mija." She had. 3 hours ago, 9 minutes of walking slowly touching things. She knew exactly where the last one was. The first thing she did was go for the panel, because the panel was the obvious thing, and obvious things must be eliminated fast. The scheduling plate on the far wall was lit and calm. It had a control surface. It had, right there in the middle of it, a broad red field that any species in the compact would have recognized instantly, and stamped into the red field in 11 scripts was the single most reassuring word ever written. "Abort." Cass hit it with the heel of her hand. The plate thought about it for a quarter of a second, the exact same quarter-second it had taken Havin's terminal to lie to him, and then it said, politely, "Abort request received. Authorization required, custody." Querying. "No signal. Abort cannot be processed at this time. Please contact your custodian." She stared at it for 1 full second. 1 second. That was all she allowed. Later, when the board asked her what she had felt at that moment, she told them the truth, which was that she had felt nothing at all except a kind of vast, cold, bottomless asterisk recognition. The sensation of a thing she had suspected for 8 months finally standing up in front of her and showing its whole face. They had built a stop button that needed permission. They had built a room that could kill you, and a button that could save you, and then they had run the button through the same nervous system as the eyes, because it had never once occurred to any of them that the eyes could close. "Please contact your custodian." "No," Cass said out loud to the machine, "you contact him." And she turned and ran. Behind her, the annex had become a scene from a species that had never learned what to do. Desi Marn was screaming, not words, just a rising tone, standing in the open with both hands over the throat as if the glow could be strangled back in. Prow and Pry Odo were still at the hatch, 6 limbs apiece, hammering at a gap the width of a hand, while a river of air from the corridor came shrieking through it in the opposite direction. That gap was a gale. That gap was the only reason any of them were still conscious, because a 2-centimeter slot to a corridor at full pressure will fight an industrial evacuation trunk for a long, long time before it loses. And the Odo twins were beating on it, trying to widen it, trying to open the thing that was keeping them alive, because the hatch was the way out, and their entire lives had taught them that the way out was where you went. Torin Val was on his knees in the middle of the floor, with his mouth open. He was not screaming, he was doing something worse. He was holding his breath, clamping it in, chest locked, all 4 arms wrapped around his own ribs, hoarding it the way you would hoard water, and Cass, running past him, took 2 steps she did not have and grabbed the back of his collar and put her mouth next to the side of his skull and shouted, "Breathe out." He shook his head, wild-eyed. "Breathe out, you idiot, or your lungs will tear." She did not stop to see if he obeyed. She had, at absolute best, 4 minutes of anyone being any use to anyone, and she was spending them at a dead sprint down 40 meters of gutted hydroponics annex toward a wall panel she had noticed 3 hours earlier and had not, at the time, understood why she was noticing. She had noticed it because it was ugly. That was all. In a station where every surface was harmonized, and every seam was sung into place by a design authority that had spent 61 years making Threshold look like a held breath, there had been, halfway down the annex's inner wall, a rectangle of composite that did not match. It had been painted over not once, several times, layer on sloppy layer, the way a thing gets painted when a succession of maintenance crews all decide independently that the ugly rectangle is somebody else's problem. Its edges were choked with sealant. Someone, at some point, had hung a decorative light strip across it. And under the paint, in raised letters that the paint had softened but not erased, in the blocky old builder's script that predated the compact's harmonized typeface, it said, "Emergency Atmosphere Manual. No power required." Cassia Ferreira reached that wall at a full run and hit it with both hands and could not open it, because it had been painted shut for 11 years by people who knew, with total confidence, that it would never be needed. She needed a lever. She had 3 hours earlier walked this room slowly and touched things, and one of the things she had touched was a torn-out grow-rack stanchion, waist-high, steel, bolted at the base by 4 fasteners of which 2 were missing. She went and got it. It took her 9 seconds to work it free, and it cost her more air than she had, and when she came back up with 1.5 meters of steel in both hands, the room had gone strange around the edges of her vision, a gray creeping in at the margins like fog on a window, and her fingers had started to feel like they belonged to someone she knew slightly. Hypoxia does not announce itself. That is the thing about it. It does not hurt. It comes in as asterisk confidence, as a pleasant, expansive certainty that everything is basically fine and that you have plenty of time and that perhaps you should sit down for a moment and think about all this properly. Cass had known that since she was 12 years old, because on a Deathworld you learn what the air does to you at altitude, and because her grandmother had taken her up a mountain and made her count backward from 100 at 4,000 meters, just so she would know what it felt like when her own mind started lying to her. "You will feel very clever," the old woman had said. "That is the symptom. When you feel clever, you are dying. Go down." So when Cassia Ferreira felt a warm and pleasant thought arrive, maybe just rest against the wall for a second, "You've done enough. Someone will come." She recognized it immediately for exactly what it was, and she said, out loud in a slurred and furious voice, "Shut up." And she jammed the end of the stanchion into the seam of the panel and hauled. The paint cracked. The panel did not move. She hauled again. Nothing. The sealant had it. It had been sealed by 3 separate crews across 11 years, and each of them had trusted the one before. She was 51 kilos. She did not have the mass. There was no angle she could take, alone, that would give her the leverage, and the gray was coming in, and Pell was somewhere behind her on the floor, and the Odo twins had stopped hammering on the hatch, and she estimated with the last cold clean part of her brain, about 90 seconds before she stopped being able to make decisions at all. She needed weight. There was, in that room, 2 meters and change of the strongest species in the compact. Cass turned around. Torrin Val was on his hands and knees 15 meters away, and he was breathing out. She saw the dust move away from his mouth. He had listened. Some animal in him had finally listened to something, and his head was down, and he was, she saw, crying in the specific, silent, appalled way of a person to whom nothing has ever happened. She walked back to him. She did not have the air to run. She got down in front of him, and she took his enormous plated face in both her small hands, and she turned it up so that he had to look at her. And she said, very slowly, so that a dying brain could follow it, "Torin, nobody is coming." He shook his head. "Nobody is coming. The eyes are closed. You closed them." She held on. "Your uncle is not coming. Custody is not coming. The interlock did not fire. The abort will not process. 61 years, 0 incidents, and nothing in this station knows we are in this room." She shook him, and it did nothing because she was 51 kilos, but he was watching her mouth like a drowning man watches a rope. "There is one thing left. It's a handle. It's on that wall. It is painted shut, and I cannot open it alone, and you are the strongest thing in this room." She watched his face. She watched, for perhaps a second and a half, the entire architecture of a young man's life come apart, 61 years of civilization, an unbroken vigil, an uncle beneath a plaque, the certainty that the walls loved him, and she watched something older and much simpler stand up in the wreckage and look out through his eyes. "Show me," said Torin Val. He could not have found the panel. He walked past it twice, even with her pointing, because his brain kept sliding off the ugly rectangle the way everyone's brain had been sliding off it for 11 years. She put his hands on it. She wrapped his 4 hands around the stanchion and set the tip in the seam and put her own hands over his and shouted, into the side of his head, with the last useful air in her body. "Pull." Kesherans are the strongest species in the compact. It is the first thing they tell you and the second thing they tell you, and it happens, as it turns out, to be true. The panel came off the wall like a scab. It came off in one piece and took a strip of the light fitting with it and clanged onto the deck, and behind it, in a recess that had not seen light in 11 years, sitting in a nest of its own dust, was a thing that had been built in the first year of Threshold Station by people who had come from somewhere else. People who had crossed the black in ships that broke. People who had once, quite recently in the memory of their species, been afraid of rooms. It was a wheel, a red wheel on a spindle, with a chain-linked butterfly damper coupling running up into the trunk line, and a reservoir tank behind it the size of a coffin, and a plate above it that said, in that same blunt old script, "Turn. Reservoir will ray flood compartment. Damper will close the evacuation trunk. This device does not require permission." Cassia Ferreira, who had gray at the edges of her vision and someone else's fingers and a mind that had begun, very sweetly, to lie to her, read that last line and laughed, an ugly, airless bark of a laugh, and put both hands on the wheel. It did not move. 11 years of paint, 11 years. Torin put his hands over hers, all 4 of them, and Marrow, who had backed against a wall and not participated, who had spent the whole afternoon looking at the floor. Marrow arrived from somewhere out of the gray and put 2 hands on the rim of the wheel as well. And the 3 of them turned it. The sound was enormous. Not the pump made no sound at all. The pump had never made a sound. The pump had been politely and competently murdering them for 6 minutes in near silence. The sound was the damper, a huge iron clack asterisk up in the trunk line, a mechanical linkage a century out of fashion doing the one thing it had been built to do, closing a throat. And then the reservoir opened, and 11 years of stored atmosphere came into the old hydroponics annex like a wave over a seawall. It came in cold. It came in loud asterisk. It knocked Cass off her feet and put her on her back on the deck with her hair blown flat across her face and her ears in agony, and she lay there for 3 full seconds and did nothing at all except take one breath, and then another, and then another, and each one of them was the single best thing that had ever happened to anyone. Then she got up, because Torin Val was face down and not moving. He was 190 kilos. That was the number they found later, when they weighed him in the infirmary and worked out what she had done. And it was the number that got repeated on 11 worlds for the next 2 years, usually wrongly, usually with the addition of details that had not happened. What actually happened was this. Cassia Ferreira, 15 years old, 51 kilos, with a burst blood vessel in her left eye and both ears bleeding, got Val into the recovery position and cleared his airway with 2 fingers and made absolutely certain he was breathing. And only then, only Asterisk then, went and did the same for Desi Marn, and then for Prau Odo, who had a dislocated shoulder from beating on a hatch, and then for Pry. She found Pell under the scaffold, conscious, shaking, unhurt. She said, "Can you walk?" And Pell said, "Yes," and she said, "Then go and stand in the corridor and shout until somebody comes," and Pell went. And then, because Val had begun to seize, a low-oxygen event in a Kesherin nervous system, does that, and she did not know it at the time. She only knew that he was convulsing and that his airway was going. Cass got both her hands under his shoulders and set her heels against the deck and dragged Asterisk. 40 meters. She did it in 11 pulls, resting between each one, counting them out loud in Portuguese because that was the language that came when the other one ran out. And at the end of it, she got him through the hands-width gap in a hatch that a folded piece of ration pack card had held open for 6.5 minutes, and out into the bright, clean, overlit corridor of Ring 4, Transverse 9, and she rolled him onto his side and sat down beside him on the floor because she could not do anything else. At 17:39 and 40 seconds, all 11 amber lights came back on. The Aegis opened its eyes. And what it saw, what it recorded faithfully, in perfect resolution, and what it would present to the Board of Inquiry as the sole objective account of the events of day 214, was a human female, unaccompanied, standing over 5 unconscious students of 4 species, in a corridor with no other witnesses, with blood on her face and her jacket missing and her hands shaking. 90 seconds later, the response cell arrived. They put Cassia Ferreira against the wall, and they restrained her hands behind her back, and they were very professional and very calm and very sorry, and the lieutenant who cuffed her said, not unkindly, "Cadet, do you understand what you're being detained for?" Cass looked past him down the corridor at 11 steady amber lights. "Yes," she said, "nothing. You're detaining me for nothing. There's no record of what happened in that room." She turned her head and spat blood onto the immaculate deck of the safest station in the galaxy. "That's the whole problem. That's been the problem for 61 years. The Board of Inquiry convened 11 days later in the atrium, beneath the plaque, because Custodian Prime Aswar Ven had requested that Venue and nobody had thought to say no. That detail went into the record. Adjudicator Vessa Troon, who had come out from the compact core with 2 clerks and a face like a closed door, wrote it down in her own hand, and it was the first indication anybody had that this was not going to go the way Threshold Station expected. Cass sat at the respondent's table in a uniform that did not fit her because her own had been taken as evidence. Her left eye was still a solid sheet of red. She had been in administrative confinement for 11 days, which meant a room with a bed and a window and a door that locked from the outside, and she had spent those 11 days doing the only thing there was to do, which was think. Across the floor, at the complainant's table, sat 4 students of 4 species and their advocates. Val was not among them. Val was in a medical chair at the back of the atrium with a monitor collar around his throat and both lower arms in supports, and he had been there since the doors opened, and he had not looked away from Cassia Ferreira once. "The charges," said Adjudicator Troon, "are grave: assault upon 4 cadets, reckless endangerment, unauthorized interference with station infrastructure." She looked up. "Custodian Prime, you will present the station's evidence." Aswar Ven rose, and he was magnificent, and he did not need notes. "Adjudicator, the Aegis is the finest security architecture ever constructed by any species." His voice filled the atrium the way water fills a cup. For 61 years it has maintained an unbroken record. It does not lie. It does not forget. It does not, whatever the respondent may claim, sleep. He let the word land with distaste. At 17:39 and 40 seconds on day 214, the Aegis recorded Cadet Ferreira standing over 5 unconscious students. That is the record. That is the whole record. And I would ask the board to consider, very carefully, what it means that the only account of the preceding 20 minutes exists exclusively in the mouth of the only participant who was still standing. He turned and he looked at Cass, and there was no malice in it at all. That was what she could never get past afterward. He was not a villain in his own head. He was a grieving man defending a cathedral. Human physiology, Ven said quietly, is not in dispute. Neither is human psychology. What is in dispute is whether this station was ever equipped to host it. They gave her the floor at midday. She had no advocate. She had refused one, which the clerks had found alarming and adjudicator Troon had found interesting. And she stood up in a uniform 3 sizes too big with her hands folded in front of her, and she said, "Adjudicator, may I put something into evidence?" "You may." Cass reached into her sleeve and took out a paper notebook, warped and softened at the corners from 8 months in a jacket pocket, and set it on the clerk's desk. Ven's crest moved. It was very slight. "This is a tally," Cass said. "Every time I saw a sensor node go dark on Threshold Station, I wrote down where it was when it happened and how long it lasted. I started on my 3rd day. There are 406 entries." The room made a soft, appalled, pitying noise. Instructor Haven has already testified that he examined this notebook on day 214 and found it consistent with published maintenance schedules. She did not look at Haven. She had asked him not to be ashamed, and he had been anyway. He was right. He checked Ring 4, sections 1 through 9. My Ring 4 entries number 71. The published sanctioned intervals for Ring 4 number 71. They match exactly. "Then the notebook proves nothing," said Ven's advocate, "except a distressing habit." "Sir," said Cass, "he checked 1 ring." "Silence." 406 entries, Cass said, across all 11 rings across 8 months. The station's published maintenance bulletin lists 118 sanctioned intervals in that period. She let it sit. She had learned that from Haven, so I would like someone to explain the other 288. Nobody said anything. "Because custody's fault log," Cass said, "says 0. 0 faults in 8 months in a system with 211,000 nodes. And I'm 15 and I'm not an engineer, and I know that's not a good number." She turned and looked directly at Oswar Ven for the first time. "Sir, you've spent 11 years telling us the Aegis never fails. I believe you believe that. But a system that never fails and a system that never reports failing look exactly the same from the outside. And there's only one way to tell them apart." She turned back to the adjudicator. "Somebody has to go and look." Adjudicator Vesa Troon adjourned the inquiry for 6 days and sent for a forensic audit team from the Compact Corps. And when they came back with a number. 14,906. That was how many fault events the Aegis had generated on Threshold Station in the last 11 years. No degradation, coverage gaps, optical drift, thermal blindness, acoustic saturation, entire corridors going amberdark for 11 to 19 minutes at a time, because the seals on housings manufactured in the station's 5th decade had begun, quietly and inevitably, to fail. 14,906 faults. And 0 of them in the log. Because there was, buried in custody's architecture, a function. A perfectly legitimate one, added in the station's 6th year for perfectly sensible reasons. The ability to reclassify a fault event as a sanction reallocation interval retroactively, so that scheduled maintenance would not clutter the incident record with noise. It required one credential. It required the credential of the custodian prime. And the audit team put up on the great display beneath the plaque a graph of its use over 11 years, and it was not a graph of a man committing a crime. It was a graph of a man drowning. In year 6, there were 4 reclassifications. In year 7, 30. In year 9, 200. By year 11, the line went up off the top of the chart and stopped being a line at all and became a wall. 4,211 reclassifications in a single year. A man sitting alone in an office every night with a list of the ways his cathedral was rotting, pressing a key, again and again and again, turning failures into features so that the number on the wall would not change. The Unbroken Vigil. Asterisk 61 years, 0 incidents. Custodian Prime, said Adjudicator Troon, into a silence you could have stood a spoon in. Did you know the Aegis was degrading? Asuar Ven stood very straight. Yes, he said. For how long? 11 years. And you reported none of it. I reported none of it. His voice did not shake. Cass respected him in that moment more than she had expected to. The retrofit was costed at 200 million. The compact would have withdrawn the academy. The families would have withdrawn their children. And I told myself every night, Adjudicator, every single night, that the degradation was cosmetic, that the core coverage held, that the intervals were brief and the corridors were empty and no one had ever come to harm, and that I was buying time to fix it properly. He looked at his hands, and no one ever did come to harm. For 11 years no one came to harm, which I took as evidence that I was right. It was evidence, said Troon, that you were lucky. Yes, said Asuar Ven, I understand that now. And then there was the schedule. Because a rot is one thing, and a rot can be forgiven, but the Board of Inquiry still had to answer the question that had brought them there, which was the question the entire compact was asking on 11 worlds. How did 5 students happen to corner a human girl in the one corridor on Threshold Station, where the eyes were closed, at the 1 hour on day 214 when they were closed? Cass had a theory. Cass had had a theory for 11 days and had said nothing, because a theory in the mouth of the accused is not evidence, it is motive. She did not have to say it. On the 4th day of the resumed inquiry, Torin Val stood up out of his medical chair, slowly, badly, with both lower arms in supports and a monitor collar around his throat. And he walked to the floor of the atrium without being called, and his advocate said, "Cadet, sit down," and he did not sit down. "Adjudicator," he said, "I would like to make a statement." "Cadet Val, you are not obliged." "I know what I'm not obliged to do." His voice was wrecked. Kesherin vocal folds do not recover quickly from hypoxia. That's why I'm doing it. He stood in the middle of the atrium, under the plaque, in front of 400 people and 211,000 sensor nodes, and he said, "On day 211, I obtained a copy of the reallocation schedule for rings 3 through 5. I obtained it from my uncle's outer office, from a clerk who believed she was doing a small favor for the Custodian Prime's nephew, and who did nothing wrong, and whose name I will give to the board privately because she has a family and this was my doing and not hers." Asuar Ven did not move. He had gone the color of ash. "I selected Transverse 9 because it was dark for 19 minutes and because structural ethics led out onto it," Torin said. "I brought 4 others. I brought a corrector wand. I intended to hurt Cadet Ferreira badly enough that she would leave this station, and I intended for there to be no record of it, and I want the board to understand that I did not hope there would be no record." He stopped. He made himself go on. "I arranged for there to be no record. That was the entire plan. That was the thing I was proudest of." He turned then with enormous difficulty, and he looked at Cass. "And then the room started to kill us," he said. "And I found out what my uncle's number was actually worth. It was worth nothing. There was no one behind the walls. There had never been anyone behind the walls. He was crying silently in the specific appalled way of a person to whom nothing has ever happened. 61 years, 0 incidents. And when I was dying on the floor of that room, the only thing in the entire galaxy that came from me was a human girl who weighs 51 kilos and who I had gone there to break. He faced the board. She told me to breathe out, and I breathed out. She put my hands on a wheel and told me to turn it, and I turned it. She dragged me 40 meters. His jaw worked. The Aegis did not save my life. My family did not save my life. My species did not save my life. She did. And I would like that on the record, because I understand now that a thing which is not on the record did not happen, and I have spent my whole life being protected by a machine that decided what happened, and I would rather be a criminal in a room where the truth gets said than an innocent man in a corridor where nobody is watching. He sat down on the floor of the atrium, because his legs would not hold him, and nobody moved to help him for a long moment. Then Cassia Ferreira got up from the respondent's table and walked across the floor and helped him up. They found the wedge. That was the other thing. The forensic team went over the old hydroponics annex millimeter by millimeter, and in the release housing of the hatch mag clamp, they found a folded rectangle of ration pack card, compressed to the thickness of a fingernail, still holding. They ran the numbers on it. It went into the final report as a 2-line finding, and it is, to this day, the single most quoted passage of that report on 11 worlds. The obstruction of the hatch mag clamp maintained a gap of 2.1 cm between the annex and the Ring 4 transverse. This gap admitted a sustained inflow of atmosphere at corridor pressure, which the evacuation trunk was unable to overcome. In the absence of this obstruction, the annex would have reached the cure cycle target pressure of 0.02 atmospheres in approximately 90 seconds. All 6 occupants would have died. Adjudicator Troon read that aloud in the atrium, and then she took off her reading lenses and looked at a 15-year-old girl with a blood-red eye, and she said, "Cadet Ferreira, you placed that wedge 3 hours before the assault." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" And Cass thought about how to explain it. She thought about the seawall and the storm coat and a hand around her wrist. She thought about a species that had spent 100,000 years being neither the fastest nor the strongest nor the largest thing in the grass, and had survived anyway, on nothing but the refusal to assume. "Because a door that can close," she said, "is a door that can close on you, and I didn't know what was going to happen in that room, ma'am. Nobody ever does. That's the whole point," she shrugged. "So you make sure the door can't shut. It costs you 30 seconds and a piece of card." "And if nothing had happened?" "Then I'd have wasted 30 seconds and a piece of card." Vessa Troon wrote that down in her own hand, too. The findings came down on the last day of the season. Asuar Ven was removed from office, stripped of custodial rank, and referred to the compact for criminal prosecution on 14,906 counts of falsified safety reporting. He did not contest any of it. He gave the board his credentials and his key, and he asked for one thing only, which was permission to be the one who took the plaque down. They said no. He asked again. They said no again, and he sat down in the atrium and put his long gray hands over his face and wept, and Cassia Ferreira, who owed him nothing, went and sat next to him for a while and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Torin Val was expelled, convicted, and sentenced to 4 years of restitution service on Threshold Station. He asked to serve it in maintenance. The charges against Cassia Ferreira were dismissed in their entirety, and the board's final report contained a single sentence about her conduct that was later carved, at the student's request, into the wall of the Ring 4 transverse. She was the only functioning safety system in the room. They tore the Aegis out of Threshold Station over the following 2 years, node by node, and put a better one back. But that was not the change. Better cameras were not the change. The change was written into the retrofit specification by adjudicator Vesa Troon herself, and it was 3 lines long, and it read, "Every compartment shall contain a manual atmospheric override, reachable by the smallest resident species without assistance. It shall not be painted, it shall not be covered. It shall not be harmonized. It shall not require permission." There are 104 of those panels on Threshold Station now. They are ugly. They are deliberately, unapologetically ugly, red, raised, stenciled in blunt old builder's script, and once every cycle, in every ring, a student is required to walk up to one and put a hand on the wheel and say out loud where the nearest 3 are. Torin Val scraped the paint off the first 60 of them himself, on his knees, over 11 months, with a hand tool. He never asked for anyone to watch him do it. The plaque came down in the spring. They did not replace it with a number, because Threshold Station had learned what numbers were for and what they were not for, and there was some argument about whether to replace it with anything at all. In the end, they put up something small, brass, unlit at head height, where you would have to actually stop and look at it, which was rather the point. Threshold Station. The eyes close. Look anyway. Cassia Ferreira graduated from the academy at Threshold 4 years later, first in her cohort in comparative environments, and she stayed. She teaches now. It is a small class, elective, unpopular with parents and adored by the students, and it meets in the old hydroponics annex, which was never retrofitted, because the annex is a museum exhibit now, and the wheel is still on the wall. The class is called *Attention*. It has no textbook. On the first day she takes them, 12 of them, 8 species, none of them older than 14, and she stands them in the middle of that big, cold, echoing room, under the dead grow lights, and she does not tell them the story. She never tells them the story. They all already know the story, and the story is not the lesson. She just says, "Close your eyes." And when they have, she says, "Now, without looking, tell me how you get out." And every year, every single year, there is a long and terrible silence, and then somebody starts crying, and then, slowly, one at a time, the small voices begin. Pell Ashenwing teaches the second half of the course. Pell is not portable anymore. They cornered a human girl after class, on the safest station in the galaxy, in the one corridor where the eyes were closed, and the entire security network failed, exactly on schedule, exactly as it had been failing for 11 years, silently, politely, with a green light on the board and a plaque on the wall, and a good man in an office turning every failure into a feature, so that no one would ever have to be afraid. It did not fail because of her. It failed because a station full of people had handed something precious to a machine, and then stopped checking whether the machine still had it. And on day 214, in a room with no witnesses, the only thing on Threshold Station that had not been quietly failing for 11 years was a 15-year-old girl who counted her exits, wrote down what she saw, and put a folded piece of card in a door, because her grandmother had told her, on a seawall in a storm, that the sea does not care that you are 11. Nothing watches over you. So look.